Tonight is January 20th, 2017, and today is a special day in America. We are with a new president, Donald J. Trump, as our new commander-in-chief. So what is it, out with the old and in with the new, or more of the same? We will find out either way. Tonight I have a special guest. His name is Scott Rickard. He is a NSA whistleblower. He's a former intelligence linguist, a veteran of communications technology. For over 3 decades, he's worked with national security and international service providers, software developers, manufacturers, and government, aerospace, and media organizations in the signals intelligence, communications security, open source intelligence, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, and communications and information technology arenas. He's a guest on PressTV on an ongoing basis. He gets involved with a lot of debates, especially with people who would consider themselves Zionists. He also is a go-to person when it comes to a lot of the ongoings in the Middle East. Welcome to the show, Scott Rickard.
Wow, thanks for having me back, Nick. I really appreciate it, man.
So what are your thoughts on the inauguration of our new commander-in-chief?
I try to see between the lines. Obviously you have people that, unfortunately, are, I guess, inconsistent with the truth. And I don't think people actually do it on purpose. I think people do it because that's what they know to be consistent. And that's what we're going to see with Donald Trump. Obviously it's what we saw with the cronies from the left, and now we're going to look at the cronies from the right, and they're going to have their day in the sun. And it's funny because people come out of the woodwork. There's a lot of people that I had no idea how supportive they were of the Republican Party until the Republican Party had a horse in the race. And way I look at things, I think you can solve the riddle down the middle. There's a lot of guys out there that just will make stuff up just to meet their agenda. I was talking with a good friend of mine. He's a retired NSA CIA guy, one of the guys that I met years ago in the 80s when I was an Arabic linguist in Greece. And he gave me the background and the scoop of this guy who has become a sort of a Clinton fanatic on this whole, Russians basically hacked our elections campaign. And the guy's gone so far as to write a book in October. Oddly, think about this now. This guy writes a book in October of last year, and then he's on MSNBC spouting this book. What timing, and he's, supposed to be this intelligence expert. And it turns out, he was an Arabic linguist in the Navy. He was a petty officer, and a bunch of guys I know that were Arabic linguists knew him and knew what kind of a guy he was. And certainly he was just peddling his agenda. And
who's this ghost person, Scott?
So this is a guy. I want you guys to look him up. He's an interesting individual. He hadn't hit my radar screen until I talked to my buddy. But he's basically a guy who's now become an expert on intelligence and Al Qaeda and jihad. His name is Malcolm Nance. He's a former U.S. Navy intelligence, and spent his career working there. And now he's become a left-wing mouthpiece for MSNBC and CNN and so on.
He sounds like the left-wing version of Roger Stone.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. That's a great, or David Horowitz if you want to go to the edges. Yeah.
Well, yes. Frank Gaffney is another player.
Another one, exactly. We could go all night. I'm sure we could pull out lists.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you're aware of a NGO think tank by the name of the Council for National Policy.
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah. That's the group that vetted Donald Trump, and he's got a lot of those people in his cabinet. Bannon.
He sure does. He's you put it in the notes tonight. It's about as Likudnik as we're gonna get.
Yes. I mean, that's as Israeli first as you're going to get.
It really it kind of shocked me when he said America first in his speech today, because I wish it was true,
Yes.
And he did come to placate a lot of the angst that we have as Americans. But I think from a words perspective, he did a fantastic job. But from a design and a plan perspective, I've seen nothing but the surface. And certainly from my own analysis at this point, he's gone so far down the path of pro-Israel that I think we're going to see one of the things he described it today in his speech. He said, strengthening existing ties. I think you're going to see those existing ties with Israel just become more than sacrosanct, which is what they are now.
I think this was the first time that a rabbi's ever spoken at the inauguration address as well.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's possible.
Yeah,
I mean, I hate to conflate Judaism with Israel, because I think it's a hijacking of the Jewish faith. I think the Jews have been very much put in the crossfire or the crosshairs based upon the political Zionist movement. I've met many of the Jewish faith that speak out adamantly against Zionism and against the annexation of Israel. So,
that seems like a similar line that Christopher Bolin takes.
Oh, does he? Oh, that's interesting.
He stated, like, once the Likudnik party took over Israel, that was the end of a civilized society for the Palestinians as well as the average Jewish people.
Well, he's being a lot more kind than I would. I'd say it has never been, obviously, in the early 1900s, it may have been a lot more innocent. But
yes. The Nakba was a joint effort of the left and right of the Jewish community. So.
Yeah, but once you hit post-World War II, it became, these were individuals that were completely tied to a decimation of their the hosts that allowed them to partake in any opportunity in immigrating into that country. Look at the tremendous types of sociological patterns across the world when a society is put under the auspice of being immigrated to. The Germans experienced that with the move of the Bolsheviks when they came into Germany. The Americans have complained about it with Mexicans. They've complained about it with Irish. They've complained about it, over and over and over again. Societies, when they're being, overrun. And this has happened, country after country after country. A great one is Libya. Libya in the early 1900s was populated by the Italians, whereby the population went from 500,000 and not Mussolini, but the Italian Empire had murdered 10% of the society in basically concentration camps.
Yes.
Starved them to death, and then populated the country in about a year with 150,000 Italians. So you went from no Italians to 1 in 4 people in the country were Italian. Now imagine, the United States, let's say there were no Arabs, and then you went to 1 in 4 were Arabs. This country would be up in arms if that had happened here. So, and obviously, now, I would say we're at the point where 1 in 4 are either Black or Hispanic. But let's be clear here that much of the country actually belonged to the Hispanics and was actually taken from them.
Well, technically, they weren't Hispanic until the Spaniards interbred with them. They were
good point.
Amerindian type people that were here prior.
Indigenous. They were indigenous people who were, the conquistadors had their way with first.
Right, but we could debate on who was here first. There's also the different concepts of giant, much larger red-haired people where there are that type of graves that they've discovered skeletons of prior to the Amerindians ever being here, and the Amerindians with the mounds.
I wouldn't put it past the Vikings to have sent out some scouts to the far corners of the earth. These guys were all over the place, for God's sake.
Well, even the ancient mound sites that are around the Mississippi Valley and all over towards the East Coast as well. The Amerindian tribesmen, the elders, said that these mounds were here before we came to America. So there's a lot of ancient history that we're just not really sure about, and a lot of it's been hidden from us. Speaking of Libya, Scott, Obama, his last days of office, decided to bomb Libya.
I saw that.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's I got to tell you, Libya turned out to be one hell of a black eye for NATO and the United States, and you have obviously, Sirte has become a sort of a rebel city against the individuals that we tried to set up in Tripoli and Benghazi. And you have a group of individuals there that are pretty much renegades that we paid, or mercenaries that are running the place. Interestingly enough, the guy that we paid to run the ground forces while we bombed the living hell out of Gaddafi's forces, Mahdi el-Harati, he had an interesting experience. He was outed by his wife when they discovered 200,000 euro was missing from her apartment in Ireland. And he went back to Ireland. But then, oddly enough, he became very active in the attack on the mercenaries that went amok post the fall of Gaddafi in Mali. And they were attacking the uranium mines that were being run by the French. And so he helped clean up that mess, and then he immediately went on to Syria to work with the Americans and their allies and the Persian Gulf allies to conduct warfare against Assad. And then, it was interesting, he came back to Libya because he was a Libyan-Irish dual citizen. He came back to Libya, and for God's sakes, they made him mayor of Tripoli. I mean, Mahdi el-Harati, what a ride, guy. He gets $800,000, about 500,000 euro from the CIA to basically run the mercenary forces for us and overthrow Gaddafi.
Is he part of that Misrata tribe that's in Libya?
I don't know his tribe. I know he was originally from Benghazi. He was part of the group that expatriated about 25 years ago. And then worked for the CIA ever since. He was actually even on the Mavi Marmara undercover when the ship tried to sail into Gaza. He was one of the people that was watching the operation for the CIA.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah. What about the individuals that were released from the prisons that Gaddafi had in prison too? Some of those people became high-level operatives as well with Libya and the Syrian operation as well, I heard.
Well, so what Gaddafi did in '69, he came back from a 2-year tour in Greece, working under NATO's occupation of Greece and with the dictatorships that we had put up in there alongside the British. And he realized, he's a 27-year-old kid, he says, hey, we're getting ripped off here. He said, here we are, giving up all of our assets to, the British and the Americans, being run by this tyrant from Benghazi, King Idris, which was another puppet like the Shah of Iran. He was the Shah of Libya for us. And so they look at him and they said, we can, he was in Turkey getting some work done on his some cardiac surgery, and he says, we could take advantage of this. If we arrest 100 guys, we can do a bloodless coup. And that's what he did. And if it wasn't for President Nixon, he would have been actually assassinated, and they would have freed those other 100 guys, and Idris would have come right back. But Nixon actually, no pun intended, nixed the idea he decided that it was no good. It wasn't going to work for him. He said, it was that he said Gaddafi's not fascist. He's not communist. It's his country. It might be the right move. And the CIA wasn't happy about it. Obviously, MI6 wasn't happy about it. And he was able to operate, fairly freely, other than being able to mine the mountains in the southeast, which, by the way, have uranium elements there that he was never allowed to actually mine. We were after him, over and over and over to keep him out of the southeastern part of his own country, right. Using Chad, French Foreign Legion, Sudanese mercenaries for decades. We fought wars with him for decades in the in the south of his own country. So, at the end of the day, he got his hand caught in the cookie jar. And this is a guy who, in my opinion, said, okay, I'll work with you guys. And he was working with us, but he was making money hand over fist. He didn't owe anybody any money. He had put the IMF out of business in Africa. He had tons of gold reserves, and his country was probably the most developed country in the history of Africa.
Absolutely. And
so now, these guys that he releases from prison, because what they did, and this is what the CIA did, and the MI6 and Mossad guys did, is they came in, they set up 100 guys, heavily armed guys, who went to police stations. And you're from the Chicago area. Imagine 100 guys going to a police station and blowing it away and stealing all the weapons, and then going to another police station and go to another police station and blow it away and steal.
I heard it was all coordinated, where it all happened at one time, not just going to each police department, but actually coordinated where it happened at multiple police departments all at one time.
It did. They took out all the police departments, and then they negotiated. And this was when the news that the Americans were getting at the time was, Gaddafi's going to kill his own people. And it's like, what do you mean kill his own people? I was like, he's got guys going to his police stations, killing his the security officers. The National Guard would be out in force here. There would be just tremendous uproar. It would be like a 9/11 event in this country, if you ask me. But yet it wouldn't be a false flag. It would be something that it would be responding to, is like, hey, these people are actually shooting our police officers, in their own stations. And so once they said they was going to negotiate with these guys, which was a huge mistake on his part, he said, I'll negotiate. He says, well, you need to free these guys from these prisons. And now let's be clear about the prisons. The prisons in Libya only held 12,000 people. This is a country of 6 million people. So on a per capita basis, even though it is 50 times smaller than the United States, that would be the equivalent of 600,000 people in prison in this country, when we have over 2.5 million.
Oh, yeah.
So on a per capita basis, he had very few people in prison as compared to the United States on a per capita basis.
They were obviously there for a good reason.
We're there for a good reason. And obviously, people were living in a very well structured society. They obviously, had to be a little bit careful about their despotic leader. I mean, I'm not saying the guy was but they were being well taken care of. It was a place you could prosper. Obviously, you had to be careful, but you could prosper. And there was no poverty. There was water was free. Bread was free. You could buy an American car there for a third what you'd pay in the United States. He subsidized the imported vehicles. So it was a different situation than anything anybody had ever seen. Absolutely. And so now he frees these guys, and then they go back to the prison at night and free another 1,000 prisoners. So so now you've got 1,200 people on the streets, and they go to a military base, and they catch the base on fire. So at this point, okay, he has done nothing that has instigated this. And this is not a peaceful protest, obviously. And so when they catch the base on fire and they burn the soldiers in their sleep, obviously Gaddafi's sending some planes in, because now he has nobody on the ground there. And he's certainly not going to send people, ground forces, because they'd be sending them to their death.
Exactly.
Why would I want to kill my own guys going after some guys that have, been like renegades? I'm going to drop bombs on them. And that's when the Americans, unfortunately, convinced the Chinese and the Russians to agree upon the Security Council. Now, that was hopefully the last time the Russians and the Chinese will make that mistake. because that was the end of the end. And so if you think about the kinds of people that were supposedly released from prison, these were people that obviously had an axe to grind against a guy who had ousted the most wealthy people. And it's the same thing that Chavez went through in Venezuela, the same thing when Batista was overthrown by Fidel Castro. This is what happens when the United States has a despotic, mafia-driven leader, and it's overthrown by some dissidents. We come in and try to defend the defenseless. You cannot defend what the United States was doing in Cuba prior to Castro. You can't defend what the United States did to Libya. You certainly can't defend, what the United States has done to Syria. And that's, when you tie that all back into, how we've conducted affairs internationally, there has to be some day of reckoning, where, the Americans kind of say, wait a second. This is a country that has done some, horrific things to other people and has never been held accountable. And so when you talk about a new presidency like Donald Trump, he's not that guy. This guy has done some more. This guy's right in bed with the mafia guys. I call him the real estate mobster in chief. I mean, this is it.
And he also purchased Resorts International from the actual Meyer Lansky mafia outfit that basically was a Mossad CIA operation that Michael Collins Piper, who towers behind Donald Trump, was what he included in that article.
Steve Wynn was at Union Station last night, partying with him. So, yeah, for sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He's tied in with all those guys. You couldn't have picked a more powerfully connected mafia guy. I'm feeling like people probably felt in the early 1930s that kind of saw through Adolf Hitler when he was coming to power. They were like, whoa, holy shit. What's going to happen next? So, I mean, it could happen here. I mean, the way that he talked with his patriotic and nationalist nature, a lot of people they're not only going to drink that Kool-Aid, they're going to shove it in intravenous as long as there's some kind of economic prospering. As long as they put money in my pocket, I don't care who they fuck over, is the way a lot of Americans feel. That dynamite stick is lit. I mean, it's ready to blow. So I can't tell you how many people I know like that.
Making America great again in a lot of people's minds is, Monsanto is going to increase their jobs by tens of thousands. Yay, go Monsanto. All the military companies that produce arms, they're increasing the amount of jobs that they're talking about. Well, that's great for America. There's more jobs. Well, what does that all entail?
Dropping
GMOs.
Bombs on babies. Dropping bombs on babies.
More military operations across the world, doing their depopulation agenda, increasing the Greater Israel Plan, making that come into fruition, all the above.
Yeah, I can see that the Odin Yanan plan is going to get a big boost. I certainly don't think the Syrians will be taking back the Golan Heights anytime soon. So
exactly.
It's going to be, and what's interesting with the tie to Russia, this is my own imagination working now, but with Russia and Exxon, I can't remember the Russian oil company, but the Russians and the Americans under Exxon cut one of the largest oil deals in the history of the world prior to these last sanctions because of the Ukraine. And obviously, when you look at the activity between what could happen between Russia and the United States getting closer, Russia has never really been that critical of
Rosneft, by the way.
That's it, Rosneft. Russia has really not been that critical of the Israeli.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Circus Maximus. I'm your host, Nick Spero. I'm on the line with Scott Rickard. And just to clarify, I am someone who looks at history, and when I look at World War II, I do see that there was a huge agenda. Germany must perish was what was written, the elimination of the German people. So I do see the Weimar Republic of Germany and the deterioration of the German people to where Adolf Hitler did empower the German people, And it was kind of like a situation with Gaddafi where that could not be allowed by international bankers and those, like, for example, the Rothschild banking dynasty, who was incarcerated and then was also able to pay his way out of that situation, to where there's a lot of revisionist history of the time of the National Socialist German government that did empower the German people like Gaddafi did for the Libyan people. So the comparison of Trump and Hitler, I think we're at a point where it's not really that great of a comparison, Scott, because of how Trump is working for the Likudniks, where I don't think that Hitler was working for...
He was in bed with some of them too. No, I agree with that, but let me put it this way: in the comparison, certainly not in the historical outcome that came from, obviously the British Empire had an axe to grind with the Germans twice. They've had axes to grind with the Russians several times as well, and certainly the Americans have adopted that same foreign policy through indoctrination of our, Encyclopedia Britannica, our Schofield Reference Bible. A lot of our mindset and our perspectives and what we actually expect to see are huge, just brainwashing effects of a society. Now, when I talk about Trump and the patriotism, because I see patriotism sometimes as racism, obviously in the case of, when you're fighting an external event like Bismarck or like Hitler, there are absolutes that I would agree with you on, whereby those individuals were actually responding to a threat. And I don't discount that whatsoever. What I will say is, in their nationalism and in their flight to gain empire or gain imperialism, there was no threshold that they weren't willing to cross at one point. And that is where a lot of there was no point at peaceful negotiation. There was, and that's what the point where the Americans have become the big bully, the new conquistadors on the block. So when you are an empire like the Roman Empire, the Polish Empire, the German empires, you have a throttle that sometimes just gets stuck. And that's where I think the Americans, and I put that sort of threshold on where I saw, a point at which people became enamored with an individual who may have led them astray at a point or two. And that's certainly been the case with many a presidency in our lifetime. I don't know your age, Nick. I don't know that much about you, but I do. I do respect your stalking, and I absolutely. I actually was nearby you. I was close to. I stayed in Schaumburg for Christmas.
Oh, did you really? I'm right down the road from there.
I know. My girlfriend's from Rockport and Elgin, so she knows. So she's a. She grew up in Wayne, and she's...
Oh yeah, I remember you telling me that. That's a great area. There's so many horse stables over there. It's a beautiful area.
But I will tell you, I'm a history guy too. But I think that we're probably on the same page. We're just not, we're just talking around each other. Because I don't disagree with you that there were, when I listened to some of the speeches that Hitler made in the early 30s, when he was talking about the aggressiveness and the imperialist nature of the British Empire, I absolutely agree with most of that.
I was going to say that Hitler did try to negotiate to where he did not want to go to war with Britain.
Early on, absolutely. I totally agree with that too. It's funny because I had a Czech historian or a history teacher, and he was an officer in the Czech army. And when the Germans showed up, his senior officer told him to go to the top of the mountain and defend the mountain. So he put the harness on his donkey and hooked up his cannon and started dragging it to the top of the mountain. And by the time he got to the top of the mountain, these mechanized vehicles came rolling up on him, and he had his hands so high in the air. He's like, "Holy mother of Jesus." Like, look at the equipment these guys got. So obviously Hitler didn't have to do a lot of fighting in Czechoslovakia and France.
Right.
But there was a point at which domination could have been throttled back and more negotiation could have been done. And there's a point at which when the Americans were dragged into it, right, because of the Zionists, and I will say this to my deathbed, that's the point at which obviously we could have worked more closely. But unfortunately, we had been hijacked by the British Empire in the 1850s. We've been working on their behalf. So that is, where I'm sure we would agree on. But from the nationalistic and the human nature of individuals, because you and I know that when you motivate the kind of people that have absolutely no information, they will do anything once you put them on the right path. It's like a hamster on a wheel. They'll just keep running. And that's what worries me about individuals like Trump and individuals that put people down a path. And obviously you get the same thing with the left. The left is doing the same thing, with their sort of fake peacenik ideology. There's obviously these are not a peaceful party. I mean, they dropped more bombs in the history of the United States. Certainly fought more wars and
in the past 8 years than ever before.
So they've absolutely fooled a society that has this Miley Cyrus with 90 million followers on Twitter and Katy Perry with another 90 million followers on Twitter crying. And think about these kids. They're growing up. They're going to vote. Mm-hmm. So this is coming. There's a wave of more brainwashed doofuses that are going to follow the left. And the left hasn't lost an election, the popular election, in the last 16, 20 years. Even
George W. Bush even lost the popular vote both times, didn't he?
Exactly. So what is happening? I mean, we live in a facade of legitimate republic or democracy, whatever you want to call it, and these are individuals that are easily led astray. And obviously, you get the wrong guy running the country, all hell could break loose. So,
if we really break it down, the baton from the British, I call it the Yiddish Empire, was passed on to America to be the dominant force in the world, to destabilize and be the neoliberal puppets in order to take natural resources and harness them and impoverish people.
We have an open checkbook to do it. We certainly don't have. Have you had any austerity pushed down on you yet with all this debt we've accumulated? Well, you know what happened. Have you seen? There's actually Greg Palast did a decent report on this one. I don't appreciate anything he's been doing lately, but Greg Palast put out a good report when they did break up GM and sold the preferred stock to Bain Capital. By the way, that's Romney's money maker. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what was interesting is when they did that, Bain Capital got all the preferred stock and gained ownership of all the Mopar stuff and all that Mopar stuff that was all through this quote unquote Rust Belt. That was all sold off to China. They sold off all the parts manufacturing to China.
Yeah, they're producing the Jeep over there in China now too.
Exactly. And then what they did is they took the profits and they tried to build an automobile manufacturer out of Israel, something called Better Car or Better something. I can't remember the name of the company, but and it failed miserably. This Better Car or Better Auto or whatever, I can't remember. It was Better something. It was the money that Romney and this Bain Capital criminals stole basically from the taxpayers. Just wiped out the remaining Mopar, GM parts industries in Ohio and Michigan, sent them all off to China, and then took the profits and tried to, did a failed automobile manufacturing company for Israel. I was like, wow, how did that thing get missed? How come that's not huge news? I'll tell you why, because the news is controlled by the guys that are hiding that kind of stuff from American people.
Oh, absolutely. What are your thoughts on Julian Assange and how all these leaks seem to have benefited Donald Trump for the election cycle?
Well, let's take a step back. Let's talk about Julian Assange. He comes out, sets up a leaking solution, right? This guy's got a place where people can throw stuff out. This Bradley Manning guy obviously puts him on the map with some pretty intense video, some pretty intense truth about American operations in Iraq, and whistleblowers. Now, oddly enough, I mean, I was a little shocked. They commuted the sentence of this kid.
Yeah.
Certainly reminds me of a little bit of Oswald. You know, Oswald was a supposedly a turncoat who defected to Russia. This guy was a Russian linguist, worked on the U2 program, the DSCP side. And then he comes back to the United States. You know, he didn't even have to be commuted his sentence. He's passing out flyers, pro-Castro flyers like flypaper in New Orleans while he's dating Judith Miller, who's weaponizing cancer. You know, so what's going to happen with this Assange guy, and what's going to happen with these Snowden guys, and what's going to happen? These guys, as they're sort of assimilated back into society, I want to see what roles they play. You know, he threatened that he would. Or he promised, not threatened, he promised that he would come to the United States and be extradited if Assange was commuted. Now he's kind of backpedaling on that because he probably didn't expect Obama to do it. Mm-hmm. And now, you know, you've got, Snowden, who's, if he had any guts, he'd just say, you know what, I'm going to take my licks because I guarantee you Rex Tillerson could negotiate his return to the United States post haste. So he needs to, get his act together and get to another country real quick, or he's going to find himself back in the United States as well.
Do you think that these three people, Snowden, Assange, and Manning, are part of this limited hangout of intelligence operations, kind of like a psyop on the people?
I would say possibly with Snowden, but he may be doing it unknowingly. And then Assange, I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the guy. I've never met him. Mm-hmm. I feel like he's a bit of an enigma to me because I like a lot that he's done. I think what he's done has been legitimate. I don't think what he's done has been, I don't care if a Martian was exposing these emails that were coming out of, Podesta's account. The fact is that if this is the kind of person that we're going to put in power in this country, then we need to, recheck our gauges because, that's out of control. I don't need an individual who's doing a pay for play and then a bunch of guys around him with their APEC, cronies running the show. And I want to see it projected that way on the American people rather than pointing the finger back to another country doing the same thing the United States has done to dozens of countries around the world over the last half century. So,
but wouldn't you agree that the leaks during the election cycle were one-sided and only exposed the Clinton operation rather than the Trump operation?
Well, yeah, but I mean, think about it. Okay, so the Trump operation could have, what are they going to expose? They're going to expose
Jeffrey Epstein and Lolita Express. That was not really discussed too much except for the Bill Clinton aspect.
I saw plenty of that, but I mean, was it picked up by the mainstream media? No. I mean, the point is that would they pick up something like that? Obviously he's gonna refute it. Because there's very little proof unless you have tapes and you can actually get people that are willing to show some information. But these were legitimate emails that they had. They didn't have good evidence. Obviously Trump's been involved. He's been indicted in New Jersey for so many things. He's in bed with all the cement monsters from New York and New Jersey. Oh, yeah. He's got plenty of dirt. This guy's not like there's not enough dirt to dig up on this guy with needing Assange. So the fact that the left, I think that the left just felt like they had won it hands down. I don't think that they, Hillary Clinton didn't even go to some of the states that she really needed to win this thing. And she, here she is campaigning in California for what? Every ad you spent in California was a waste of money. So, you should have been spending your money in Wisconsin and spending your money in Ohio and, going after the states that you might lose, So I blame it on just stupidity and arrogance more than Russians or information, For God's sakes, this is somebody who had, a tremendous illegal network of propagandists working on her behalf. The fact that a Russian guy catches some dirt on her, so who cares if it was the Russians? In fact, if it was the Russians, my hat's off to them. Thank you for doing a favor and exposing some crap to the United States citizens, because, and when you do it to Donald Trump, I'll thank you as well. So, my point is that, I don't care who tells me, as long as they, if my own government and my own press is not figuring out, I look to foreign nations to actually, help us, because we certainly can't help ourselves.
Trump had been saying that the elections are rigged, the popular vote, if the numbers are accurate, with 3 million being the figure that Hillary won by the popular vote, would you say that the elections were rigged for Donald Trump's favor then?
No, the elections are rigged regardless who won. Let's be clear. We live in a society where people are very poorly informed. They're well over entertained, and they're ambivalent, to anything that doesn't fit their comfort level on the information that they've been exposed to. So if you start telling them things like we're talking about on your program tonight, they're going to be like, oh, I've never heard that before. This is making me feel uncomfortable. I got to turn this off, So
that's what we're all about, trying to make people feel a little uncomfortable, to say, hey, maybe I need to question my paradigm, my reality here.
But the human nature is going to work against us on that. The fact is that you can't take this rock salt information and shove it in. Nobody's going to want it. It doesn't fit their paradigm.
Yes.
So that paradigm shift doesn't work with the average Joe. And we live in the Homer Simpson society. Everybody in the society knows the Kardashians and every damn character on Homer Simpson Factor. But if you ask them at the point where Libya was in Africa, they'd lose. They can't even pick out one of the biggest countries in Africa.
Right. Geography is not a strong point for the average person.
Geography is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, exactly.
You're being too kind.
Yeah, but as far as the elections being rigged, so in my opinion, Donald Trump was selected.
Been rigged since the 1850s.
Yeah, I think Trump was selected for a higher purpose. I think he's been groomed for quite a bit. Roger Stone has been trying to push him to run for office since '88. Sure. And his mentor was Roy Cohen, who you probably are aware of as well.
Let's be clear. Every one of the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates were selected. So it was a lot of guys on the internet call it a selection. Mm-hmm. It's not an election. And certainly whatever one rises to the top, they're like, oh, good, it's that one. Oh, good, it's that one. They don't care. They like something about anybody that rises to the top. A funny story that I learned, I was a delegate for the Republican Party in the 2012 election, and I went to the straw poll in Orlando, and the leader was Rick Perry. And it was interesting, as Rick Perry was, obviously going to take the straw poll on Thursday. Well, Thursday night he did a terrible job in the Fox News debate, and he just really did such a bad job that on Friday everybody was discussing how to replace Rick Perry, and they decided to replace him with Herman Cain. So on Saturday, everybody showed up. 3,000 people showed up with blue and white buttons and blue and white signs to support Herman Cain. And Herman Cain hadn't won a primary or anything up to that point, and here he was winning the straw poll in Florida. And I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, how did that happen? So I went and put on a Herman Cain button and went to all the after parties to figure it out. And I ran into a guy, and this guy was getting kissed on the ring by guys like Lee Atwater, and his father was.
I covered Lee Atwater on my show.
So Lee Atwater's father was the guy that got Reagan into office. So he killed his brother. Poured a bunch of hot oil on his brother by accident. And this is a guy who what the hell is this guy kissing this guy's ring for? And it wasn't literally kissing the ring, but he was being very respectful to this tall man. I went up and shook his hand, or I went up and talked to him, and he said, I was like, I can't believe it. I said, it's so great. We finally got somebody that's going to take out Obama. So glad we found Herman Cain. I don't know what happened, but at my synagogue in Brevard County, everybody came down and we all decided we're going to do Herman Cain. And thankfully, everybody else in the Republican Party in Florida did. And he said, well, shake the hand of the man that made that decision. His name is Bill Diamond. I call him the Kingmaker. Bill Diamond was the guy that put Giuliani on the map. He's the guy that, I mean, imagine that, a Republican mayor of New York. That's amazing. How the hell did he do that? Well, he did that because he's the most powerful money bundler in the Republican Party. He put $400 million in Romney's pocket to run in 2012. And
he's like an Adelson or a Mercer.
He takes Adelson and Mercer's money and tells people where to put it. So this guy is the kingpin of the kingpins.
So did you pretend that you left your synagogue, or you actually go to a synagogue?
No, I just pretended because I knew he was Jewish. So
Smart move, man. Smart move. Smart move, man. That was good.
So he's leading me around, and he's telling me the story. He says, well, I started out, I really wanted Bachman, but she's so stupid she wouldn't even return my calls. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. He says, then I went with Rick Perry, but God darn it, that guy can't talk his way out of a paper bag. And I was like, wow. And he goes, I settled on Herman Cain because Herman, he's got it straight. Well, obviously he moved straight from Herman Cain to and he moved off to Newt Gingrich, and Newt Gingrich lost in Florida to Romney, and then he moved on to Romney, and he put all his money, because when these bundlers put their money out, they don't go into the coffers of the candidates. They go into money bundlers' coffers, and these guys hold the cash to see who's going to get the next cash. You know, obviously when you have a Robert Mercer and these guys deal direct. But some of these guys have to deal through, a lot of these organizations and these PACs talk to each other. And they're like, who are you giving money to? Who are you giving money to? Well, what's Bill Diamond doing? What's Bill Diamond doing? And Bill Diamond's a kingmaker. I mean, he put Giuliani on the map. He's the guy. These are the guys that invested $75 million in World Trade Center 7. These are insider 9/11 guys.
Yeah.
These guys are no joke. So, these are the guys they call them the puppet masters or the kingmakers.
What do you think of the foreknowledge of Donald Trump in his book, mentioning Osama bin Laden and another attack in New York that he wrote about in 2000? It seemed like possibly inside knowledge. What are your thoughts on that?
No, it's possible. I mean, I got to tell you, when you look at the connections, Bill Diamond and Donald Trump have been friends since they're 20 years old, and they're both 70. So, they've known each other a long time. So this guy is no joke. I mean, Donald Trump is tied in at the highest levels of anybody and the longest relationships to the most powerful AIPAC lobby guys. And when he came out, basically, saying some things that were basically putting Israel in check, those things went by the wayside real fast. He hasn't done that since the AIPAC meeting.
Absolutely.
He's been lockstep, because he probably didn't know any better. This guy is a guy who's, naive, and at the same time, he's impulsive and hasty. I mean, this guy would sell his own grandmother's shoes, if he needed something. So I don't think that we're dealing with a very, I wouldn't give him the benefit of the doubt of being some intellectual.
He's got such a high IQ, though, that he keeps writing about.
It's the biggest. It's the best.
Well, it also seems like Jared Kushner is pulling a lot of the strings.
Now, here's another thing. There's no way he's going to go after Israel. This Jared Kushner kid. That's a young, powerful, pro-Israel kid, and he's
Talmudic scholar too.
Yeah. He's very religious, and this is scary. This might be our worst nightmare. It might be something that I got to tell you, I really see the Oded Yinon plan, and that's what I was getting to before the last break. It's probably going to break again on me. When you see what Russia's doing, and Russia's never been hard on Israel, Russia and America are going to allow Israel to do some crazy stuff. Yeah, I just don't. Once you allow, the two of the biggest powers in the world are going to combine and allow Oded Yinon's plan just to blow up.
And then Eric Prince is being empowered too, especially by having a sister being part of the
That's
cabinet.
crazy, isn't it?
I know.
And she's about as unconfident doofus that I've seen running. If they approve that, I mean, the fix is in.
I know. And then there's an article that I want people to look into. It's from The Intercept. Notorious mercenary Eric Prince is advising Trump from the shadows.
I've read that, yeah. As much hell as I like to give Glenn Greenwald, that's one of the more legit. I don't, Glenn's just too soft-core Zionist for me. He speaks out against. If there was a left-wing party in power in Israel, he'd be a lot kinder to Israel. So, but I do appreciate some of the writers that he's got work for him, and although he's blocked me on many occasions on many of the networks, yeah, I still appreciate his Omidyar finance network.
Hey, Scott, you want to hold on for maybe another 15 minutes to a half an hour?
I think I'd love to, man. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I appreciate it. We'll be right back.
The talking heads, the daily press, they cultivate stupidity and harvest ignorance. They point a crooked finger and they're all unanimous by calling me extremist because I'm down on Zionists. So now I want to sing a new song. I want to be an extremist. I want to join a militia and wear camouflage. I want to be an extremist and run around and sing a rabble-rousing rebel song and sympathize with the skitties who realize it was the Germans wrong. I want to be an extremist. I want to get the job done.
Welcome back, everybody, to Circus Maximus. I am your host, Nick Spero. This is hour number 2. And I'm on the show with Scott Rickard, and we are just touching upon Blackwater and Eric Prince and Betsy DeVos, she's the education secretary. I don't think she's been approved as of yet, but the Eric Prince situation is interesting because a lot of the, I guess you call it alt-right, during the Trump campaign and his presidency, and you've got a media outlet by the name of Breitbart that has interviewed Eric Prince a few different times already. Not sure if you heard those interviews or not, Scott, but at least 2 of them I've heard Eric Prince say how the Phoenix program should be re-implemented. What are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, that's a good tie. Breitbart and the Eric Prince connection. That's cool too. That it's interesting. When you look at the kinds of things that you cover, and you actually do a great job. I have to admit, Nick, that I'm not as familiar with all your programs, but you get down to the nitty gritty. And when you talk about the nature of you brought up earlier Robert Mercer, his a lot of people don't know his ties back into Breitbart, and when you talk about the individuals now that it's almost as if it's the connections are just so in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the fact that this is a guy who's pushed tremendous amounts of horrific decimation in many countries on behalf of the American taxpayer, and then sadly you call it the Trump effect. It had nothing to do with Trump. Trump just tapped into it. These guys were already doing it. All Trump did was give them more purpose. These guys are ready to go. They cheer the fact that this Eric Prince is going to be, their leader again. There are many a mercenary, many a military guys who would, basically stick their hand in the air and say, "Fantastic. Let's get his sister to educate our kids, and let's get this war on. Let's go."
Mm-hmm.
So it and then Breitbart, my God, I mean, this is that the Robert Mercer is right up that same alley. This guy has financed a tremendous communications network that pretty much basically he brought on to run Trump's win. And sure enough, he was with the help of Ted Cruz's organization, once he bailed out, he was good to go. Trump actually had some pretty strategic people that were smarter than Clinton's people. So when you talk about the ties with Eric Prince and the ties to Robert Mercer and the ties to this whole communications network through Breitbart, it's pretty scary. If it's that easy to tap into a culture, a warring faction culture that will eat this stuff like it was, popcorn at a movie. That's the kind of thing we're up against, and sadly, I'm not speaking as a Democrat. Sadly, the Democrats have the same thing. They just have a different flavor of popcorn, and they're doing the same things with a different set of players. And obviously they've got ties to their military-industrial complex ties in their different countries. They've got their donators who are donating to their specific foundations, much like the Clinton foundations. There will be a tremendous amount of investment made along these same lines, and all these guys who basically are very well connected now to the most powerful man in the world and the United States are going to take advantage of it, and it's pretty scary. I mean, I'm shocked. It definitely didn't catch me flat-footed, but as it rolls out and the kinds of things that we're seeing, and as it unfolds, it's a lot more well connected than I imagined. So.
Yeah, did you see the article that Breitbart put out? Breitbart, founded in America but conceived in Israel.
No, where was that?
It's on the Breitbart. It's their own article, and it's got a picture of Andrew Breitbart.
Oh, I do remember that article. That's an older one, though, isn't it?
Yeah. With Netanyahu and Jim Hoft of the Gateway Pundit and a bunch of other operatives.
Come on, let's be clear. Look at Hezbollah since the 80s. This is just the blossoming of Hezbollah, as if it needed more blossoming. I mean, this is the flower. This is the flower that has probably grown more ubiquitously than any communication network in the history of the world. When I went to the Kill the Deal rally in Washington, D.C. in front of the Capitol, they had the likes of obviously Donald Trump, and they had Ted Cruz, they had all of the Sarah Palins and those guys from the Duck Dynasty and Jesus Glenn Beck, but there was a sign associated with it. I can't remember all the names on the sign, but there was probably at least 60 organizations on the sign, and of those organizations, obviously included things like Camera and all of the traditional pro-Israel lobby media outlets. But what's interesting is that the newer one, one of the guys that a lot of the right-wing warmongering pro-Israel nut jobs follow, is a very popular guy on, I would say very popular, but somewhat popular guy on Fox News. This guy, Anthony Schaefer. Tony Schaefer was one of the guys that kind of, mildly blew the whistle on the 9/11, and he became sort of dipping his heels or toes into the 9/11 truther organization to pull out whatever right-wing nut jobs he could. Mm-hmm. And he did well. I mean, he pulled a lot out because he, wrote some pretty revealing information about the suspicions that the Defense Intelligence Agency had around the involvement and the sort of conspiracy of 9/11. Well, that being said, at the same time, he's also extremely tied to the pro-Israel lobby, and he's very closely tied to Mike Flynn, now the one of the head national security guys for our country. Mm-hmm. So this is what we've come up with, is that they've actually built a tremendous network. I think one of the think tanks that Tony Schaefer's tied to is called the London Center. It's I forget the guy's first name. It might be Jack. No, Jack London is an actor. But the London Center is yet again another one of these sort of organizations that was represented on this sign for all of these organizations that were against this kill the deal of Iran. So you have this whole foundation. This is from 2000 and I'm going to say 14 or 13. What the deal was trying to be, the deal's been around for about a year and a half now. So this was about 6 months or so before the deal was agreed upon. So about 2 years ago. And this whole organization and these types of, tremendous communications networks, it doesn't surprise me that, there was Breitbart was born in Israel and has, become yet again another annual flowering of the pro-Israel Hezbollah network. I mean, it is, I almost feel as though Pierre Omidyar's network is a, Hezbollah light type network, even though it does expose stuff. It exposed stuff to people who still will be sympathetic to the Oded Yanan plan eventually.
Yeah, kind of like an Alex Jones today with.
Well, Alex Jones is definitely not a level Oded Yanan light. I mean, please, this guy has been masking his pro-Israel Hezbollah. Now that he's got he's definitely going to carry the sword to the dragon now.
With Roger Stone being somebody that's regularly on the show and even doing shows on there now, it's getting the people who were 9/11 truthers to then question themselves and say, well, maybe Israel isn't so bad.
No, I got to tell you, I mean, Alex Jones is the same thing. It's like flypaper. It's like Hezbollah flypaper. Because if you look back at Alex Jones, he might have said, half a dozen things that were critical of Israel. But now, he's might as well be like Pastor Hagee, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
He's on the march. He's got Jesus on speed dial, and they're ready to build Solomon's temple.
Absolutely,
so,
absolutely. What are your thoughts on the connection with Michael Flynn? I know that you've done some work focusing on him and how he was part of the drug running of Afghanistan, I think I read.
Yeah, there was a point at which before he ran the DIA, he was running the military forces in Afghanistan, and one of his main tasks was to make sure that the opium was transported to the right people out of Afghanistan. The opium trade worldwide is well over $600 or $700 billion, and a lot of this opium makes it into the the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of people say, "Oh, but that's synthetically derived." I'm like, no, you don't understand. When you synthesize opiates, that just allows your body to assimilate it when you take it by pill form. I was like, people don't realize it. They think that this stuff is like made in a vacuum in these pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
No, they actually have to have product to make it with.
Exactly. You just can't concoct it out of thin air.
Yeah. So I mean, I have to, you have to actually explain it to people, and which kind of makes me feel like, am I living in idiocracy? Is this real? I mean,
we really are.
should I pinch myself? I mean, because yes, this opium, and a lot of it does make it into the illegal drug trade. More of it now that they've basically cracked down on the hillbilly heroin oxycodone industry. But prior to the crackdown on the oxycodone industry, obviously it was just coming out in drogues and pills through the state of Florida. 90% of the prescriptions in the state of Florida were ending up in states across the country, because people would actually come here to fill their, fill prescriptions, and then they go home and sell them.
And now they're mixing fentanyl and elephant tranquilizer, or not tranquilizer, but painkiller.
Whatever they can find, because to replace for their addiction. And then obviously,
when it's killing people though, because it's an elephant painkiller. Shit.
Raw heroin's making its way back, because there's a market for it, because they had a lot of guys that got addicted to the oxycodone.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, I've had neighbors' kids that were hooked on this stuff, spent time in jail already.
My brother died from a heroin overdose, actually.
Sure. No, it's horrific. I mean, it's very similar to what happened in the 70s and 80s with the cocaine epidemic. Obviously, the 70s with the heroin epidemic that was caused by the CIA out of Burma. But this particular opium trade that Mike Flynn ran out of Afghanistan now represents 80% of the world's production. It's all grown in a 600 square mile area around Kandahar.
I heard it was over 90%, Scott. Is
maybe
is
up to
80 a
90.
little low?
It may be low now. I haven't been following it as close as I did in the past, and I got to tell you, it's if you're really going to have a president that's going to come in and say, I'm going to clean up this problem, they'll be napalming and burning the opium fields in Afghanistan day one, and then maybe for the actual real need for some sort of pain management or obviously morphine for some sort of operations and true medical needs, they'll actually set up a business in the United States where we might want to grow it here. If you really want it made by American, how would we grow our own medicine? It's not like we can't grow opium in this country. We got plenty of land to do it.
Yeah.
So, we don't need to be raising it in Afghanistan and selling it surreptitiously around the world to fill the coffers of all the criminals that are making money around it.
Well, you need money to fund the black operations, though. They're not going to want to get rid of that.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's what Ollie North covered up. And what's interesting is we turned state's evidence to the Justice Department, that whole thing. Yeah, I have to share with you something, put a little pieces together with me. In Florida, there's a great movie that came out in 2016 called The Infiltrator. The Infiltrator is a story about a guy named Robert Mazur who worked here in Tampa area out of Palm Harbor. And what he did is he infiltrated Pablo Escobar's money laundering. And he actually took down one bank in the world, even though there were dozen banks actually that were working to launder money for not only Escobar but for the CIA and other people that were making tons of money. I don't know if you've seen Cocaine Cowboys from Raconteur. It's another great documentary. Cocaine Cowboys talks about the cocaine trade in Florida and around the United States in the 70s and 80s. And basically it goes into detail about how the Federal Reserve in Miami, and this is a fact, was taking 7 times the deposits of all the other Federal Reserves combined.
Wow.
Right.
Nice
and
money laundering operation there, huh?
During Carter, Reagan, and Bush Sr. and Clinton, right? So that long that was going on, right? And it all got shut down when the Mexicans and the Colombians and the Cubans were fighting over profits in Miami, so they had to shut it down. But at the end of the day, Robert Mazur and this infiltrator actually infiltrated the money laundering of Pablo Escobar's up to one of the top 2-3 guys, and took down 75 people in a mock wedding here about a mile from my house here in Tarpon Springs, over in Innsbruck. Doing a mock wedding when everybody came to the bachelor party. They arrested 75 of the most powerful guys in Pablo Escobar's money laundering business. Interestingly enough, the only bank that got taken down was a bank called BCCI. Now, I don't believe Robert Mazur when he says that he took down BCCI just by chance. BCCI was the most powerful bank in the history of Pakistan, and they were partnered with the Middle Eastern guys. And so they took down only one bank, even though there were dozens involved. And they only busted about half a dozen guys at that bank because the CIA had a bunch of accounts at that bank too.
Of course.
Yeah. Not just that bank, but that bank as well. So what's interesting is that the only bank that suffered and failed after this huge cocaine boom in the 70s and the 80s in the United States was BCCI. And BCCI just happened to be owned by the Pakistanis and some Middle Eastern people. So I think, it's very selective justice. And so that's what's unfortunate is that same thing with the heroin trade and same thing with this Mike Flynn guy. This is selective justice. This is not a guy who's going to carry out ethical justice. This is not a guy who's going to carry out. This is very anti-Iranian. Him with Mad Dog Mattis, I can easily see us working with Russia, unfortunately, to destroy Iran's infrastructure.
Yeah.
And honest to God, I wouldn't put it past Putin to sell out the Iranians. It's not like he's been that close with them.
True. And he's got his own ambitions as far as like a Eurasian type of empire.
He and Tillerson have done the biggest oil deal in the history of mankind. And it turns out it's twice as big as they thought it was because there's more reserves there than they imagined.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's a big mess.
Yeah. So what do you think Flynn's role is going to be? Is he still going to be in charge of the drug operations like he was before, or has he got a different duty in mind?
Well, I mean, obviously, in his capacity, he's tied to the intelligence community. He's tied to the military. He's obviously has a tremendous amount of influence on a lot of people, and he has a lot of dirt on a lot of people. So whatever he wants to do, Trump isn't going to be anywhere near him to reject what he wants to do. So I think he's going to have free reign. He's going to have free reign to continue the drug trade. He's going to have free reign to continue the CIA operations and intel operations. I don't think much is going to slow down. In fact, I think it's going to be ramped up, and I think it's going to be ramped up because they're going to claim massive amounts of facts against Islamic terrorism, and they're going to use that as their boogeyman and their Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. That's we were all taught that story as a kid. You got to chase some boogeyman, and that's going to be their new boogeyman. It used to be Al Qaeda. Now it's these guys going to run with the ISIS torch.
Yeah, I see more of these Operation Gladio events taking place in Europe and America, like these active shooters that, a lot of times it's drills that go live kind of a thing.
Well, I mean, Operation Gladio, you have a lot of individuals who are, willful participants who really don't know that they're being co-opted. That's like I use Snowden as an example. Think about it. Snowden was in Geneva, a kid who couldn't make it because of some injury in the military, ends up, obviously with a veteran, a disabled veteran opportunity, qualified for security clearance, got a little bit of knowledge in IT, and somebody put a bug in his ear and said, what we're doing here isn't quite right. And he's like, really? Yeah, that's interesting. I'll think about that. And so, that's all it takes. Somebody he respected, somebody that he thought, hey, and he honestly, he's still part of the machine. He still believes that in this war on terror, he still believes that, you got to have the technology to drive the privacy of the, so he still plays the game. And I think he's a willful, he's an unwilling, willful idiot for the infrastructure, and it's easy to do because. Go ahead.
I was going to say, what do you think about WikiLeaks and Assange, where they still go with the official story of 9/11?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing is that who could go with Philip Zelikows, story? Are you serious? I mean, a friend of mine is a writer for a major newspaper for politics in Maine, and Scott Thistle was a Morse code operator with me at NSA. And, Scott's read the book, and what happens is that as you envelop yourself, in this 9/11 Commission report, the problem is that people have an inability to see past, what if it's not consistent with that they could consider absolutely possible. It's impossible for somebody to take that kind of drastic of a step. Well, these are people that don't realize that the USS Liberty was a very similar effect, that the Gulf of Tonkin was a similar effect, that the Maine was a similar effect.
Or Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, was considered a similar effect. Whether or not, if you're going to allow these kinds of traumatic events to occur, that's what causes people to.
Are you hearing an echo?
I do. Maybe the dial pad guys have allowed the NSA to do their recordings across their CALIA services.
No, it's gone away. We're good now.
Maybe we just got shift to another disc. We filled the disc.
Yeah, I'm sure we're being listened to. We do cover some hot topics here.
Fantastic. I got to tell you, one of my friends is he's retired CIA now, and the guy across from me was running the ISR program here at CENTCOM. He's now running it up at Pentagon, and he looked at me and he goes, Scott, they got a file on you. And to be honest with you, in the report that came out recently, where they were saying that the Russians hacked the elections, and they were naming Russian programs that were actually supposedly providing falsified information against the U.S. government and being like propaganda. Two of the programs that were actually identified were Breaking the Set, which is Abby Martin, which I think she's getting smarter as she gets older, but as a younger, I think that she was a little too egotistical and not very open-minded
And more naive.
Naive, that's probably a better way of saying it. And then because I do like a lot of her reporting, she's quite good. And then the other show that was noted was The Truth Seeker by Daniel Bushell. And I did, out of the 24 shows that he aired, I did 6 of them.
Oh, so, there you go.
Yeah, so if they're naming that show on a CIA report, I guarantee you,
there's a file on you.
I'm surprised they don't get a better massage at the airport, for God's sakes.
Yeah, really, right? Well, you got to have a little bit of that illusion that, they don't really care about me, but they really do.
Well, not that they care about us, but, obviously there's guys who have jobs. They say, well, what did he talk about? Was it anything that we could use against him in a court of law? Well, I guess there's probably nothing we can do now. He didn't work for us since the 1980s, for God's sakes. But 42 years old, obviously you've had something that brought you to this, probably about 10 years ago, you started doing your podcast?
2008.
Yeah, so 9 years ago. Here you've been doing this for 9 years. You obviously have, uncovered and researched tremendous amounts of information, comparatively to the average bear. Mm-hmm. What got you started?
Yeah, good question.
And then, what have you sort of, learned in the meantime, and where are you going?
Yeah, good question, Scott. What got me started, I was going through a divorce with my wife at the time and had a lot of extra time. And my brother told me, hey, you should get on MySpace. And there's a lot of women that are on there that you can interact with and get your mind off of your wife, So okay. I ended up connecting with some childhood friends and things of that nature. They saw that, MySpace was the big thing back then before Facebook.
Sure.
And one of my friends, Mike, he was posting posts on Ron Paul and Alex Jones and a concept called the New World Order. And I was like, wow, this is pretty fascinating stuff here. So then what I ended up doing, rather than just keeping myself in a bubble with just his information, I started following a lot of his friends. And then that branched off to where I was getting involved with listening to podcasts and radio networks such as like Oracle Broadcasting, which is a defunct network now. But a lot of the people that have come through Renegade have also been hosts on Oracle. And I was looking into a lot of the secret societies, the occult, think tanks, NGOs, and I was looking into the bloodline concept with all these different world leaders and how a lot of them have been related to one another, and sure. Just things of that nature that just blew my mind, to where I found a radio host who's no longer with us by the name of William Cooper. You might know who that is.
I am not sure, yeah.
Yeah, he was like the Alex Jones before Alex Jones. Alex Jones actually interviewed him before too. And yeah, and he technically was the radio host that predicted 9/11, saying, this is ridiculous how CNN has reporters who can go and interview Osama bin Laden when the world's most powerful nation with the biggest budget can't find him. And here's CNN reporters able to interview Osama bin Laden. You guys better brace yourselves for something to happen, and they're going to blame Osama bin Laden for it. And this was in June, like a month before Alex Jones had said anything about this. And you could tell that Alex Jones was perusing Bill Cooper's shows and kind of taking
on the
a lot of
bad
his
wagon.
stuff.
Right,
yeah.
right.
My elevation.
What was his background? You know?
He was naval intelligence.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, he probably knew what he was talking about.
Yeah. And he was on shortwave radio all over the country and things of that nature. He wrote a book called Behold the Pale Horse. He was kind of like my mentor in a way when it comes to my research. So that's what elevated me to be motivated to look into the deep states and the occult, the hidden knowledge that a lot of these world leaders practice, like Crowleyan magic. And you see a lot of your high-level intelligence agencies tied into the occult, like Scientology and the CIA, and how they utilize Discordian magic and order out of chaos, utilizing drugs like the rise of LSD into the social engineering and the counterculture and things in that nature. So
probably one thing you reminded me of that you probably know, Jim Morrison, his father, right?
Yes. Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff just kind of strikes me as like, that's a little odd. And you know how I found out about that? Here I am, I'm reading the obituary of his father dying. And in the obituary it mentions, and by the way, he was the father of Jim Morrison. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I was like, I'll be darned. I was like, well, how come that wasn't common knowledge?
Exactly. There's a reason for that. So, so the things that they don't teach us in school or they don't talk about in the media, that's what I was interested in. I was like, wow, I got to re-educate myself, because the things that the education system taught me was just to pretty much keep me dumbed down and servant to the system.
Well, that's all they knew too. I mean, so where do you think all this is going? I mean, what can we do to, like, make our flower blossom as good as Breitbart's, for God's sakes? I mean, how can we make that happen?
Well, they got a lot of money behind them. That's for sure.
Well, I was talking to a couple of guys, and I was thinking, how do we get, an NGO or a think tank and start, talking to the folks that could most benefit from this, the American people, and
that's what we need.
We need to find a way to tap into, the guys who are both disgruntled with, what we've gotten from Hillary and Trump, and say, how the hell do we break this paradigm? And where, who are the guys, that aren't interested in, well, if I could just make some more money, I don't care, but the guys that are saying, listen, I'm successful. I see where this is going. Obviously you're bucking the system, and you're saying, look, this is not working for me. I'm trying to figure out how this works, and I'm looking at all the knobs and levers that are being pulled by the wizard and figure this out. And not a lot of people have the time. You took the time, and apparently you're able to afford the time still since your divorce.
Yeah. So. Well, my finances have been fluctuating up and down. Last year was just horrible for me. To me, money, the material aspect, as long as I've got the lights on, the water's running, my son has clothes on his back, because I'm a full-time dad now.
Nice.
It's really my son and I've got an older daughter. I've got a grandson.
Wow, 42, a grandson. You're a early starter, brother. Just saying.
Yeah, I started at 17, became a father, so I didn't get to see the world because I became a dad pretty early on, and
Congratulations.
yeah,
That's seeing the world from a different perspective, though.
it sure is. It sure is. Hey, Scott, we do have my buddy Greg from Kansas City calling in.
Yeah.
What's going on, Greg? How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm enjoying the conversation. I wanted to ask Scott. He was bringing up some very interesting information that I'm hearing for the first time about General Flynn's involvement in opium. Do you have any good links online where you could get some really details on that?
Well, I doubt there's a lot of links online with the American military's involvement in the opium trade, but I will tell you this: if you do some history on Mike Flynn's leadership and look for specifically his leadership time frame that he worked within Afghanistan, that was a time frame in which the Afghan opium trade was very much taken under the wing and held very close to the cuff with the American military. And you'll find tons of articles about the American military protecting the opium fields. And what's most important to understand about opium and the production and the shipment is it could go anywhere. And what they want to do is they want to make sure it goes to the right places so the right people make the right money. Because the lucrative nature of that product, to put it in perspective, to carry around $1 million in gold in a briefcase, right? You'd have to have one hell of a large briefcase, and it would be, way too heavy for you to carry around. But to carry $1 million in heroin or any kind of refined morphine in a briefcase, you will have tremendous amounts of profitability. This is what made cocaine and heroin so profitable, is it's so light and so easy to move around. It's basically a pharmaceutical gold, and that's what's made it. If you take a company the size of let's say Exxon, it's almost a trillion, $900 billion company. Opium trade out of Afghanistan, which now represents, with what Nick's saying, in 90% of the world's production, that's a $600 billion to $700 billion industry. 90% of that's coming out of a country that's one of the poorest countries in the world. So who's making all that money? And that's what you need to understand, is that that's going on a regular basis, and the guy in charge of watching that for a period of time was Mike Flynn. Now, the individuals that are watching it now, as you know, there's a lot less news coming out of Afghanistan than there was, because a lot less individuals are over there covering it. It's not as hot. It's not as you don't have as many reporters over there, and certainly it would be very dangerous to be covering. Because at one point when individuals were covering it and there was news coming out, it was very easy to understand that the U.S. military was heavily involved in not only the protection of the fields, but the transport of the product. And look at where the actual, the product was ending up. I have never seen more Oxycontin pills in my life. I mean, they're just all over the state of Florida.
My source for 90% of the world's heroin coming from Afghanistan is from Global Research.
Yeah, Global Research is pretty good. They've been accused of being pro-Russian, but there have been a lot of great journalists that have worked there, and a lot of their information that comes out of Global Research can be corroborated on a pretty large scale. And that's what, if I learned anything working at the NSA, never believe anything anybody tells you. Never believe anything that you read, and only believe about half of what you see. So, the problem that we deal with today is in the virtual world, it's like a puzzle. And, if you read James Bamford's book, James Bamford wrote The Puzzle Palace about the NSA. The idea of being able to corroborate information is really where intelligence lies. And what happens with the information that's available to us, we have a much broader scale of information available to us today than ever before. The problem is taking the time to disseminate through it. And that's what keeps the intelligence community pretty much naive and ignorant. Is that what happens is that as an intelligence operator, you have a portal, so you're like in a ship looking out one window, and you only see that part of the sea. There can be something going on the other side of the ship where there's land and everything, but you think you're out to sea. You could be at port. So that's how ignorant that the intelligence community can be. So, if a lot of those guys won't take the time that Nick's taken and that I've taken and other people have taken. So there's just a massive amount, tsunami of information out there. So to say if there's any specific link, I can't tell you any link that I've seen in the past, but I will tell you this, that there's tremendous amounts of information out there about the history of what the Americans have done in Afghanistan and Burma and the kinds of involvement. What's an interesting tie, if you want to look at it, a really cool tie, the Krugerrand is an interesting tie in South Africa. The Krugerrand was actually created by Leslie Deek's father. I think his name was Nicholas Deeks. Nicholas Deeks was a Hungarian operative who worked with the Americans he was going to actually work in Europe to go against Adolf Hitler, but they ended up using him in Asia to help the Chinese go against the Japanese. But what ended up happening is that obviously it was a failure because the Chinese didn't help us much. He ended up getting totally involved with Dulles and the whole military-industrial complex, and he was doing weapons and drugs and selling a lot of this and negotiating a lot of arms deals. And he ended up creating the Krugerrand as a way to actually finance and pay off deals. And this
sounds like another Khashoggi.
It was before Khashoggi, but basically these guys actually got tied in later with Khashoggi and with Semyon Mogilevich out of Russia, who was providing the weapons out of the former Soviet states in Bulgaria and Hungary and Romania. And he was the guy that they called the Israeli in Charlie Wilson's war. Charlie Wilson's, the Americans and the CIA were buying Soviet-made weapons from a Russian mobster named Semyon Mogilevich. And all these guys are actually tied together in this global arms trade and drug trade industry that was
like
actually
Arnon Milchan too, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, when you look at that kind of activity, this drug and arms dealer business, most Americans are only familiar with, say, the Iran-Contra deal. With the drugs for arms deal. That was just the status quo. Yep. And it was just the one story that made it to the front page.
And that's like that bank that you referred to, the Pakistani bank that had to be the fall guy for what was going on.
Couldn't believe it. Yeah, I was like, that's a piece that I totally missed. And I was like on the fringe. That was the portal I was looking at. And I just learned that last year. So,
hey, Scott, we got another caller, I'm sorry, from Los Angeles. What's going on?
Hi, Nick, Scott, Greg, this is Jeremy, Greg's friend from Lawrence calling in.
Hey, Jeremy, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks. I've definitely been appreciating the conversation I've been hearing in the last hour here. And maybe a couple of things I would ask Scott to address would be, one, on the problem side, the analysis side. To follow on Greg's question about Afghanistan, was there some type of detente or consensus in terms of the different power parties in terms of September 11th? Because it looks like 9/11 was driven largely by this Likud cell, but Brzezinski and the realist crowd were the dogs that didn't bark in a way. And do you think there was basically that Afghanistan was basically the bone that was thrown to Brzezinski, since Brzezinski is obsessed with Russia and sort of the crossroads of the world, and then there was an agreement that after we go to Afghanistan, we then move into the clean break program in Iraq to Syria to Iran and back to Lebanon? Or was it more a necessity of the nature of the intelligence legend side of the operation and the patsies that it had to be Al-Qaeda, and so that we had to sort of do Afghanistan first?
Well, I mean, I would say it more or less came to the fact that here was a guy who had been our, right-hand man. Osama bin Laden ran 5 divisions for us across the country of Afghanistan, successfully, committing to a tremendous war against Russia. Obviously, the payment back for that success was, pretty much a slap in the face when it came to the fact that Osama bin Laden had, created his own sort of, revolution against what the United States had tried to accomplish in that region. He had obviously been very well received by the individuals there that we to become our allies, and then basically shut us out. At the same time, we had lost interest because of other activities that we were involved with. You had an opportunity to create this sort of false flag scenario and use him as your Al Qaeda boogeyman. And when you have a nail, then you have this hammer that, the American military, it wasn't really a gift to Brzezinski as much as it was, as you said, more a gift to the Zionists. And it wasn't a fact that, the Zionists, all they wanted to see was a war on the actual Arab culture that the Americans would get behind. So I believe, for me, obviously it was a first step in the plan to, if you look at the what's the general's name, Wesley Clark. When Wesley Clark talks about the plans that he saw, I went to school with Wesley Clark's daughter outside of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. He was stationed there for a short period, and I will tell you this. When he was adamantly saying that plan to take out, what was it, 7 countries in 5 years or something like that, that was the plan, and it was the first of many plans. And it wasn't as if, they had to start there first. It was just that was the steps in the plan. It wasn't, the plan was, okay, we can pin this on this guy, we can say that he was involved, and then this will allow us to cascade. And obviously the plan wasn't well thought out. We're talking about individuals that were duping an entire nation. Since then, the plan has unraveled in one of the most horrific ways. I mean, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq. Obviously Afghanistan was the easiest one to pull the wool over our eyes. But if you can't see it now, and the next step is Iran, for God's sakes, wake the hell up. This is a plan that's been laid out in front of us, and it was supposed to be a 5-year plan. What idiots came up with a plan that thought that they could wipe out, somewhere around 150 million people around the planet and make that work? Well, that I had no idea how supportive they were of the Republican Party until the Republican Party had a horse in the race. And way I look at things, I think you can solve the riddle down the middle. There's a lot of guys out there that just will make stuff up just to meet their agenda. I was talking with a good friend of mine. He's a retired NSA CIA guy, one of the guys that I met years ago in the 80s when I was an Arabic linguist in Greece. And he gave me the background and the scoop of this guy who has become a sort of a Clinton fanatic on this whole, Russians basically hacked our elections campaign. And the guy's gone so far as to write a book in October. Oddly, think about this now. This guy writes a book in October of last year. And then he's on MSNBC spouting this book. What timing? And he's supposed to be this intelligence expert. And it turns out, he was an Arabic linguist in the Navy. He was a petty officer, and a bunch of guys I know that were Arabic linguists knew him and knew what kind of a guy he was. And certainly he was just peddling his agenda. And
who's this ghost person, Scott? That
so this is a guy. I want you guys to look him up. He's an interesting individual. He hadn't hit my radar screen until I talked to my buddy. But he's basically a guy who's now become an expert on intelligence and Al Qaeda and jihad. His name is Malcolm Nance. He's a former U.S. Navy intelligence, and spent his career working there. And now he's become a left-wing mouthpiece for MSNBC and CNN and so on.
He sounds like the left-wing version of Roger Stone.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Fire or the crosshairs based upon the political Zionist movement. I've met many of the Jewish faith that speak out adamantly against Zionism and against the annexation of Israel. So,
that seems like a similar line that Christopher Bolin takes.
Does he? That's interesting.
He stated, like, once the Likudnik party took over Israel, that was the end of a civilized society for the Palestinians as well as the average Jewish people.
He's being a lot more kind than I would. I'd say it has never been, obviously, in the early 1900s, it may have been a lot more innocent. But
yes. The Nakba was a joint effort of the left and right of the Jewish community. So.
Yeah, but once you hit post-World War II, it became, these were individuals that were completely tied to a decimation of their the hosts that allowed them to partake in any opportunity in immigrating into that country. Look at the tremendous types of sociological patterns across the world when a society is put under the auspice of being immigrated to. The Germans experienced that with the move of the Bolsheviks when they came into Germany. The Americans have complained about it with Mexicans. They've complained about it with Irish. They've complained about it, over and over and over again. Societies, when they're being, overrun. And this has happened, country after country after country. A great one is Libya. Libya in the early 1900s was populated by the Italians, whereby the population went from, 500,000. And
tonight is January 20th, 2017, and today is a special day in America. We are with a new president, Donald J. Trump, as our new commander-in-chief. So what is it? Out with the old and in with the new, or more of the same? We will find out either way. Tonight I have a special guest. His name is Scott Rickard. He is a NSA whistleblower. He's a former intelligence linguist, a veteran of communications technology. For over 3 decades, he's worked with national security and international service providers, software developers, manufacturers, and government, aerospace, and media organizations in the signals intelligence, communication security, open source intelligence, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, and communications and information technology arenas. He's a guest on PressTV on an ongoing basis. He gets involved with a lot of debates, especially with people who would consider themselves Zionists. He also is a go-to person when it comes to a lot of the ongoings in the Middle East. Welcome to the show, Scott Rickard.
Wow, thanks for having me back, Nick. I really appreciate it, man.
So what are your thoughts on the inauguration of our new commander-in-chief?
I try to see between the lines. Obviously you have people that, unfortunately, are, I guess, inconsistent with the truth. And I don't think people actually do it on purpose. I think people do it because that's what they know to be consistent. And that's what we're going to see, with, Donald Trump. Obviously it's what we saw with the cronies from the left. And now we're going to look at the cronies from the right, and they're going to have their day in the sun. And, it's funny because, people come out of the woodwork. There's a lot of people. That's a great, or David Horowitz if you want to go to the edges. So, yeah.
Well,
yes.
Frank Gaffney is another player
Another
there.
one, exactly. We could go all night. I'm sure we could pull out lists.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you're aware of a NGO think tank by the name of the Council for National Policy.
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah. That's the group that vetted Donald Trump, and he's got a lot of those people in his cabinet. Bannon.
He sure does. He's you put it in the notes tonight. It's about as Likudnik as we're gonna get.
Yes.
And,
I mean, that's as Israeli first as you're gonna get.
It really it kind of shocked me when he said America first in his speech today, because I wish it was true,
Yes.
And he did come to placate a lot of the angst that we have as Americans, but I think from a words perspective he did a fantastic job. But from a design and a plan perspective, I've seen nothing but the surface. And certainly from my own analysis at this point, he's gone, so far down the path of pro-Israel that I think we're going to see one of the things he described it today in his speech. He said strengthening existing ties. I think you're going to see those existing ties with Israel just become more than sacrosanct, which is what they are now.
I think this was the first time that a rabbi has ever spoken at the inauguration address as well.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's possible.
Yeah,
I mean, I hate to conflate Judaism with Israel, because I think it's a hijacking of the Jewish faith. I think the Jews have been very much put in the cross. Not Mussolini, but the Italian Empire had murdered 10% of the society in basically concentration camps.
Yes.
Starved them to death, and then populated the country in about a year with 150,000 Italians. So you went from no Italians to 1 in 4 people in the country were Italian. Now imagine, the United States, let's say there were no Arabs, and then you went to 1 in 4 were Arabs. This country would be up in arms if that had happened here. So, and obviously now I would say we're at the point where 1 in 4 are either Black or Hispanic. But let's be clear here that much of the country actually belonged to the Hispanics and was actually taken from them.
Well, technically they weren't Hispanic until the Spaniards interbred with them. They were
good point.
Amerindian type people that
Sure.
were here prior. And
Indigenous. They were indigenous people who were, the conquistadors had their way with first.
right, but we could debate on who was here first. There's also the different concepts of giant, much larger red-haired people, where there are that type of graves that they've discovered skeletons of prior to the Amerindians ever being here, and the Amerindians with the mounds.
I wouldn't put it past the Vikings to have sent out some scouts to the far corners of the earth. These guys were all over the place, for God's sake.
Well, even the ancient mound sites that are around the Mississippi Valley and all over towards the East Coast as well. The Amerindian tribesmen, the elders, said that these mounds were here before we came.